What do you think turned the apostles into people who turned the world upside down? We get a hint in the prologue to John. We beheld his glory.
Go to your studies. Flee there, not to become smarter than the next man, but to behold his glory.
You're listening to Behold His Glory, a RBYA podcast where we look to Christ as we discuss biblical and theological truths. Join us as we behold His glory. Welcome to the very first episode of the Behold His Glory podcast, or as I like to call it, Shortcast, because for now these will be a little bit shorter than most podcasts. Today's might be a little bit longer since it's the first episode, but we will see where God leads us with it, and we hope that this podcast will be a blessing to you as it is a blessing for us to produce it. As most of you know by now, our theme for this year is the person and work of Christ, taken right out of Colossians 1:15 through 20. Here the Apostle Paul reveals 6 attributes of Christ: that he is God, Creator, Sustainer, Supreme Ruler, Reconciler, and Man. And at each event, we'll be highlighting each one of these attributes. So from now until winter camp, our focus will be on the first one: He is God. In other words, we will be focusing on the deity of Christ. What is the deity of Christ? To put it simply, it is the doctrine that teaches that Jesus Christ, although he is truly a man, he is also truly God. More specifically, he is the second person of the Trinity. He's not God the Father, nor is he God the Holy Spirit, but he is God the Son. In his very being and nature, he is God. Think of human beings. By nature and by being, you and I and the rest of all of human beings are all the same. We're all one in that sense. But when it comes to personhood, we're all distinct and unique. I know it's impossible to fully grasp this concept as it gets into the doctrine of the Trinity, and we aren't called to understand it fully and perfectly, but we are called to believe in it and understand it biblically, as much as God has revealed it to us in His Word. This month, we've been celebrating Advent, the coming of Christ into the world, and there's no greater word that comes to my mind during this time than the word Emmanuel, which means God with us. Matthew 1:23. Jesus is named Emmanuel because he is God with us. Not just that he represents God as his messenger, but that he himself is God ontologically in his very nature and being. In John chapter 1 verse 14, which is the inspiration for this podcast title, John says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have beheld his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now we could spend hours just talking about this verse alone because there's so much depth and profoundness to it. But let's look briefly at what John is telling us here. He says the Word, who he reveals is God in verse 1, right? John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He says the Word became flesh, meaning God the infinite became finite and dwelt among us. Here John uses the word skeno in the Greek, which means to encamp. This type of dwelling is a tent dwelling. Isn't that interesting? Why in the world is John telling us that the Word, who we know is Jesus, came down and encamped among us like in a tent? Do you remember how God dwelt with his people in the Old Testament, specifically in Exodus? In Exodus 29:45, God says, "I will dwell among the people of Israel and will be their God, and they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God." What John is telling us is that the one and only true God, Yahweh, the same deity that dwelt with Israel in the tabernacle after the exodus out of Egypt, is the same God who comes to dwell with his people again. Only this time, he comes in the person of Jesus Christ. He continues, "And we have beheld his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, is sent by the Father, the first person of the Trinity, to reveal to us grace and truth. This is why we celebrate Christmas. This is why we worship Christ. This is why we behold His glory, because He is our God and has come to show us grace and truth. Like I said, we can spend hours, even days, talking about John 1:14, and especially about the deity of Christ, because it's all over the Bible. The deity of Christ is actually one of the most crucial, if not the most crucial, teachings we need to know as Christians. Because Christ is the foundation of our faith, we must know Him rightly. We must know that although He is truly man, like us in every way, yet without sin, He is also truly God.